Just lay back and let me take care of you. 5 words that would shatter the walls around Alvara Trenholm's heart. But first, they had to break through her stubborn pride. In the dusty frontier town of Bitter Creek, Texas, where weakness meant death and trust was a luxury few could afford, a hardened cowgirl was about to meet her match in an Eastern doctor who refused to take no for an answer. This is a story of 2 wounded souls finding healing in each other's arms, where love bloomed fiercer than wildflowers in the unforgiving Texas sun. Welcome to a tale that will take you on a journey through the American frontier, where passion burns as hot as the desert wind. Stay with me until the very end of this epic love story, and don't forget to comment below with your city, so I can see how far this story has traveled across the world. The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the Trenholm ranch, casting long shadows across the weathered wooden fence posts that stretched toward the horizon like sentinels guarding secrets. Alvara Trenholm stood in the center of the corral, her leather boots planted firmly in the red dirt, watching a wild Mustang circle her with eyes full of fire and defiance. Sweat beaded on her forehead beneath the brim of her worn Stetson, but she didn't flinch as the stallion reared up hooves, cutting through the air just feet from her face. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice steady as granite. "We both know how this ends." At 26, Alvara had earned her reputation as the toughest ranch hand in 3 counties. She could break a horse faster than most men shoot a rattlesnake at 50 yards, and had once single-handedly driven off a pack of wolves threatening her cattle. Her hands were calloused from years of hard work, her skin bronzed by the Texas sun, and her green eyes held the kind of steel that came from facing down life's storms without blinking. The Mustang snorted and pawed the ground, muscles rippling beneath his dark coat. Alvara took a step forward, her hand extended, the pain in her right side, which had been bothering her for weeks, now chose that moment to flare up like a brand against her ribs. She gritted her teeth and pushed through it, just as she pushed through everything else that threatened to slow her down. Alvara. The voice belonged to Miguel Santos, her ranch foreman, and the closest thing she had to family since her father died 3 years ago. "You need to see this." She glanced toward the gate where Miguel stood, holding a piece of paper, his weathered face creased with concern. The Mustang took advantage of her momentary distraction, charging toward the far end of the corral with a triumphant whinny. "What is it?" she asked, walking over with that particular gait she'd perfected, confident but not rushed, strong but not aggressive. Every movement calculated to show the world she was in control. Miguel handed her the telegram, his dark eyes worried. "Came in from town this morning. It's about the banknote." Alvara's jaw tightened as she read the words that confirmed her worst fears. The bank in Bitter Creek was calling in her loan early. Apparently some Eastern investors had bought up her debt and wanted immediate payment. $2,500 money she didn't have, not with cattle prices down and last year's drought still affecting her herd. "How long do we have?" she asked, crumpling the paper in her fist. 30 days. 30 days to come up with more money than she'd ever seen at one time. 30 days to save the ranch that had been in her family for 2 generations. 30 days to prove that a woman could make it on her own in this harsh, unforgiving country. The pain in her side stabbed again, sharper this time, and she pressed her hand against her ribs. Miguel noticed immediately. "You're hurting again," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is getting worse, Alvara. You need to see the doctor." "I'm fine." She snapped the words automatic as breathing. "Just pulled something lifting fence posts yesterday. I don't have time to waste sitting in some doctor's office." Miguel shook his head, his mustache twitching with disapproval. "Your papa, God rest his soul, he was stubborn too, but he knew when to ask for help." The mention of her father hit like a physical blow. Samuel Trenholm had been a giant of a man, feared and respected throughout Texas. He'd built this ranch with his bare hands and raised Alvara to be just as tough as any son. But Miguel was right. Her father had known when pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. "The doctor can wait," she said finally. "Right now, I need to figure out how to save this place." She spent the rest of the morning reviewing the ranch's books, looking for money that simply wasn't there. The numbers didn't lie. She was broke and getting broker every day. The drought had killed half her grass, forcing her to buy expensive feed. 3 of her best breeding cows had died of disease last winter, and now the bank wanted money she simply didn't have. By afternoon, the pain in her side had become a constant throbbing reminder that something was seriously wrong. She tried to ignore it as she rode out to check on the cattle in the north pasture, but every bounce of her horse's gait sent fresh agony shooting through her torso. The cattle looked thin despite her best efforts to keep them fed. Their ribs showed through their dusty coats, and their eyes held that hollow look that came from too little water and too much hardship. Just like everything else in her life lately, they were surviving, but not thriving. As she sat on her horse, overlooking her struggling herd, Alvara allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. What if she couldn't save the ranch? What if she was the Trenholm who lost everything her family had worked for? The thought made her stomach churn worse than the mysterious pain in her side. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Miguel found her on the front porch of the ranch house, staring out at the land that might not be hers much longer. "I talked to Jim Morrison at the bank today," he said, settling into the chair beside her with a groan. At 62, Miguel's joints reminded him daily of decades spent working cattle. "And he says there might be another way. Some of the big ranchers up north are looking for partners. If you were willing to merge operations—" "You mean sell out?" Alvara said flatly. "I mean survive." She was quiet for a long moment, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Papa would roll over in his grave." "Your papa would want you to live," Miguel countered. "This ranch meant everything to him, but you meant more." The pain struck again, so sharp this time that she couldn't quite suppress a small gasp. Miguel was on his feet instantly. "That's it," he declared. "Tomorrow morning you're going to town to see the doctor. No arguments." "Miguel." "No arguments, Alvara. I've been watching you hurt for weeks now, and it's getting worse. Whatever's wrong with you, ignoring it won't make it go away." She wanted to fight him on it, but deep down she knew he was right. The pain was getting worse, and she couldn't afford to be laid up if there was any chance of saving the ranch. Maybe the doctor could give her something for the pain so she could focus on more important things. "Fine," she said finally, "but I'm not staying long. I have work to do." The next morning dawned clear and hot, with the kind of merciless blue sky that promised another scorching day. Alvara dressed in her best clothes, which meant a clean shirt and pants without holes, and rode into Bitter Creek on her favorite horse, a spirited mare named Thunder. Bitter Creek was typical of frontier towns, a single main street lined with wooden buildings that looked like they'd been thrown up in a hurry and might blow away in the next big wind. The saloon, the general store, the blacksmith, the bank that was about to take her ranch, and tucked between them all a small building with a freshly painted sign that read, "Dr. Jarth Cobburn, Physician." Alvara had heard about the new doctor from the townspeople, a young man from back east who'd set up practice just 6 months ago. Some said he was running from something, others claimed he was the son of a wealthy family who'd been sent west to toughen up. Nobody seemed to know for sure, but everyone agreed he was different from old Doc Henderson, who'd delivered half the babies in the county before retiring to his rocking chair. She tied Thunder to the hitching post and stood for a moment, gathering her courage. Asking for help went against every instinct she'd developed over the years. In her world, weakness was something predators could smell from miles away. The door to the doctor's office opened with a soft bell chime, and Alvara found herself in a clean, well-organized waiting room that smelled of carbolic acid and something else, something expensive and Eastern that she couldn't identify. Medical books lined shelves along one wall and framed diplomas hung beside them, all bearing the name Jarth Cobburn and universities she'd never heard of. "May I help you?" The voice came from a doorway leading to what she assumed was the examination room. Alvara turned and felt her breath catch in her throat. Dr. Jarth Cobburn was nothing like what she'd expected. Instead of the elderly, bearded man she'd pictured, she found herself looking at someone close to her own age, with dark hair, intelligent brown eyes, and hands that looked like they'd never done a day's hard labor. He was tall and lean, wearing a clean white shirt and dark trousers that probably cost more than she made in a month. Everything about him screamed money and education and a soft life lived far from the harsh realities of frontier existence. "I'm Alvara Trenholm," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze steadily. "I need to see the doctor." "That would be me," he said, and she noticed he didn't have the drawl that marked most Texans. His accent was cultured, refined, the kind of voice she'd heard from traveling salesmen and government officials. "Please come in." The examination room was even more impressive than the waiting area. Gleaming instruments filled glass cases, and books stacked every available surface. This wasn't the rough and ready frontier medicine she was used to. This was something altogether more sophisticated and intimidating. "What seems to be the problem, Miss Trenholm?" Dr. Cobburn asked, washing his hands in a porcelain basin. "It's nothing serious," Alvara said quickly. "Just been having some pain in my side. Probably pulled something working cattle." He dried his hands and turned to face her, those intelligent eyes studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "How long have you been experiencing this pain?" "Few weeks, maybe a month." "And where exactly is the pain located?" She pressed her hand against her right side just below her ribs. "Here, sometimes it spreads around to my back." Dr. Cobburn nodded, making notes on a piece of paper. "Have you noticed any other symptoms, nausea, fever, changes in appetite?" Alvara hesitated. Now that he mentioned it, she had been feeling queasy lately, and food hadn't held much appeal. But admitting that felt like showing weakness, and she'd spent her whole life learning not to do that. "Maybe a little," she said reluctantly. "I'll need to examine you," he said. "If you could lie down on the table here." "That's not necessary," Alvara said quickly, taking a step toward the door. "Can't you just give me something for the pain?" Dr. Coburn's expression grew serious. "Miss Trenholm, based on what you've described, I'm concerned about several possible conditions, some of which could be quite serious if left untreated. I can't properly diagnose you without an examination." The word serious sent a chill down Alvara's spine. She couldn't afford to be sick, not now when the ranch needed her more than ever. But the thought of lying down and letting this stranger poke and prod at her made her skin crawl. "Look, doctor," she said, her voice taking on the edge it got when she was cornered. "I appreciate your concern, but I don't have time for this. I've got cattle to tend and a ranch to run. Just give me some laudanum or whatever you've got for pain, and I'll be on my way." Dr. Cobburn set down his pen and looked at her directly. "Miss Trenholm, ignoring severe abdominal pain is not brave, it's dangerous. You could be dealing with anything from a kidney stone to appendicitis. If it's the latter and it ruptures—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Alvara understood the implication. Death. Slow, painful death, far from help, and surrounded by vultures, both human and animal, waiting to pick apart everything she'd worked for. But the idea of submitting to examination, of lying helpless while this soft-handed Eastern doctor touched her, made panic rise in her chest like floodwater. "I said no," she snapped, backing toward the door. "I'll take my chances." "Miss Trenholm, wait." But Alvara was already moving her hand on the door handle. The pain chose that moment to strike again, harder than it ever had before, doubling her over with a gasp she couldn't suppress. Dr. Cobburn was beside her in an instant, his hand gentle but firm on her arm. "Just lay back and let me take care of you," he said softly. The words hit her like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had said something like that to her? When was the last time anyone had offered to take care of her instead of the other way around? Her father had loved her, but he'd raised her to be strong, independent, self-reliant. Miguel cared about her, but he looked to her for leadership, not the other way around. She couldn't remember the last time someone had seen her vulnerability and offered comfort instead of judgment. For just a moment, she wavered. The pain in her side was getting worse, and this man seemed to genuinely want to help. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to let someone else be strong for a little while. But then her pride reasserted itself, sharp as a slap across the face. She was Alvara Trenholm, daughter of Samuel Trenholm, owner of the Trenholm Ranch. She didn't need anyone to take care of her, especially not some pampered Eastern doctor who probably wouldn't last 5 minutes in the real world. "I don't need anyone to take care of me," she said, jerking away from his touch. "I've been taking care of myself just fine for 26 years. Dr. Cobburn's expression remained calm, but she caught something in his eyes. Disappointment, concern, whatever it was, it made her angry. "Suit yourself," he said quietly. "But if the pain gets worse or if you develop a fever, come back immediately. Don't wait." Alvara straightened up, forcing herself to ignore the throbbing in her side. "That won't be necessary." She left the doctor's office with as much dignity as she could muster, but once she was outside, she had to lean against Thunder's warm flank for a moment to catch her breath. The pain was subsiding to its usual dull ache, but she could still feel Dr. Coburn's words echoing in her mind. "Just lay back and let me take care of you." No one had ever said anything like that to her before. The strange thing was, for just a second she'd actually wanted to. The thought terrified her more than any pain could. The ride back to the ranch gave her time to think, and by the time she reached home, she'd convinced herself she'd done the right thing. She didn't need some fancy Eastern doctor telling her what to do with her own body. She'd survived this long without help, and she'd continue to do so. But as the days passed, the pain grew worse. It was now a constant presence, sometimes sharp, sometimes dull, but never completely gone. She found herself moving more carefully, avoiding sudden movements that might trigger the stabbing sensation that took her breath away. Miguel noticed, of course. He watched her with worried eyes and made pointed comments about doctors and stubbornness, but Alvara ignored him. She had more important things to worry about than a little pain. The bank notice had set off a chain of events she couldn't control. Word had gotten out that the Trenholm Ranch was in trouble, and suddenly every landowner in 3 counties was circling like vultures. Some came with offers to buy her out for far less than the ranch was worth. Others came with proposals for partnerships that would essentially make her a hired hand on her own land. She turned them all down, but with each rejection her options grew narrower. 18 days left until the bank note came due, and she was no closer to finding the money than she'd been when she started. The pain was constant now, a grinding ache that made it hard to think clearly. She'd started taking shots of whiskey to dull it, but that only helped for short periods and made her fuzzy-headed when she needed to be sharp. It was during one of these whiskey-fogged afternoons that she found herself thinking about Dr. Cobburn again. Not about his medical advice, but about the way he'd looked at her, like she was worth worrying about, like she mattered. The thought made her angry at herself. She didn't have time for foolish romantic notions, especially about some soft-handed stranger who'd probably run back east at the first sign of real trouble. But the memory of his voice lingered. "Just lay back and let me take care of you." What would it be like, she wondered, to trust someone that completely? To let down her guard and allow someone else to be strong for a while? The question bothered her so much that she saddled Thunder and rode out to check on the north pasture, hoping the work would clear her head. But when she dismounted to fix a broken fence post, the pain hit her like a lightning bolt, dropping her to her knees in the red dirt. For several long minutes, she knelt there, gasping, sweat pouring down her face, despite the late afternoon chill. When the worst of it passed, she managed to pull herself upright and complete the fence repair, but her hands were shaking and her vision kept blurring at the edges. This was more than a pulled muscle. Deep down, she'd known it for weeks. But admitting it meant admitting she might not be strong enough to handle whatever was wrong. It meant acknowledging that her body could betray her just when she needed it most. That night she sat on her front porch with a glass of whiskey, staring out at the stars and trying to come to terms with the possibility that she might lose everything. The ranch, her independence, maybe even her life, if Dr. Cobburn was right about the seriousness of her condition. Miguel joined her as he did most evenings, settling into the chair beside her with a grunt of effort. "Talk to Tom Bradley today," he said after a while. "He's willing to offer $3,000 for the whole spread." Alvara nearly choked on her whiskey. $3,000? This place is worth 10 times that. "Not to someone who needs money fast," Miguel said gently, "and not with cattle prices what they are. 3,000 would pay off the banknote with money left over, but it would also mean giving up everything her family had built, starting over with nothing, probably working as a hired hand for someone else." "There's got to be another way," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe there is," Miguel said carefully, "but you're not going to find it if you're too sick to think straight." The words hung in the air between them. Miguel was right, and they both knew it. She couldn't keep pretending the pain wasn't getting worse, that she wasn't getting sicker every day. "That doctor seemed like a decent sort," Miguel continued. "Smart, too, from what folks in town are saying. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to listen to what he has to say." Alvara wanted to argue, but the pain chose that moment to flare again, making her gasp and double over in her chair. Miguel was beside her instantly, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. "That's it," he said firmly. "Tomorrow morning we're going back to town, and this time you're going to let the man do his job." Too weak to argue, Alvara just nodded. Maybe Miguel was right. Maybe it was time to swallow her pride and admit she needed help. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the coyotes howl in the distance, one thought kept running through her mind: just lay back and let me take care of you. What if she actually did? What if she trusted this stranger with her health, her vulnerability, maybe even her heart? The idea terrified her more than death itself, because Alvara Trenholm had learned long ago that the only person she could truly depend on was herself. But with 15 days left to save her ranch and pain that was threatening to consume her completely, she was running out of options. Maybe it was time to take the biggest risk of her life. Maybe it was time to let someone else be strong. The wind picked up outside her window, carrying the scent of sage and dust and the promise of change. Tomorrow she would ride back to town and face whatever Dr. Jarth Cobburn had to tell her. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether her pride was worth more than her life. Tonight she closed her eyes and tried not to think about gentle brown eyes and a voice that offered comfort instead of judgment. Tried not to wonder what it would feel like to lay back and let someone take care of her for once in her stubborn, independent life. But the thoughts came anyway, and with them a longing she didn't dare acknowledge, and a fear that went deeper than any physical pain. The fear of needing someone more than they needed her. The fear of falling. The morning that would change everything dawned with an ominous stillness, the kind that made seasoned ranchers check the horizon for storm clouds. Alvara woke before sunrise, her body drenched in sweat, and the pain in her side now a constant grinding presence that made even breathing an effort. She'd barely slept, haunted by fevered dreams where gentle brown eyes watched her from shadows, and a cultured voice whispered promises she was too afraid to believe. Miguel was already waiting by the corral when she stumbled outside, his weathered face creased with worry as he took in her pale complexion and the way she held herself, carefully protecting her injured side. "Madre de Dios," he muttered, crossing himself. "You look like death warmed over." "I'm fine," Alvara said automatically, but the words came out weak and unconvincing. Even thunder seemed to sense something was wrong, nickering softly and nuzzling her shoulder as she approached. "No, you're not fine," Miguel said firmly, taking the reins from her trembling hands. "And we're not pretending anymore. I'm riding with you to town, and you're seeing that doctor if I have to tie you to his examination table myself." Any other day, Alvara would have fought him on it. Any other day, she would have climbed onto Thunder's back and ridden away from his concerned hovering, determined to handle her problems alone. But today, the simple act of walking to the corral had left her lightheaded and nauseous, and the thought of facing the long ride to Bitter Creek without support made her stomach churn. "Fine," she whispered, and Miguel's eyes widened at how easily she'd capitulated. That more than anything told him how serious her condition had become. The ride to town was a nightmare of jarring pain and dizzy spells. Every step Thunder took sent fresh agony shooting through Alvara's torso, and by the time they reached the main street of Bitter Creek, she was slumped forward in the saddle, clutching the horn to keep from falling. Miguel was off his horse and beside her in seconds, his strong hands steadying her as she slid to the ground. Her legs nearly buckled and she had to lean heavily against him to stay upright. "Easy, mija," he murmured, using the endearment he'd called her since she was a child. "We're almost there." The bell above Dr. Coburn's door chimed as they entered, and Alvara heard quick footsteps approaching before she saw the man himself. When Dr. Cobburn appeared in the doorway to the examination room, his expression immediately shifted from polite inquiry to sharp concern. "Miss Trenholm," he said, moving swiftly to her other side and helping Miguel support her weight. "What happened?" "She's been getting worse," Miguel answered when Alvara remained silent, her energy focused entirely on staying conscious. "The pain, it's bad now, real bad." Dr. Coburn's jaw tightened as he looked at Alvara's drawn face and the way she held herself. Without another word, he and Miguel helped her into the examination room and onto the table where she collapsed with a soft groan of relief. "Mr. Dr. Cobburn looked at Miguel questioningly. "Santos, Miguel Santos. I'm the foreman at Miss Alvara's ranch." "Mr. Santos, I'll need to examine Miss Trenholm privately. You can wait outside and I'll update you when I'm finished." Miguel looked uncertain, glancing between the doctor and Alvara's pale face. "I don't know if she should be alone right now." "I'll take good care of her," Dr. Cobburn said quietly. "I promise." Something in his tone must have convinced Miguel, because after a moment's hesitation he nodded and squeezed Alvara's hand gently before leaving the room. Alone with the doctor, Alvara felt her carefully constructed defenses crumbling. The pain was so intense now that she could barely think, and the fear she'd been pushing down for weeks rose up to choke her. "Please," she whispered the word, torn from her throat. "Help me." Dr. Coburn's expression softened immediately. "That's exactly what I'm going to do," he said, washing his hands quickly and efficiently. "But first, I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Trust." Such a simple word, but for Alvara, it represented the most dangerous thing in the world. Trust meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant weakness, and weakness meant death in her harsh world. But as another wave of pain crashed over her, she found herself nodding weakly. "Good," Dr. Cobburn said, his voice gentle but professional. "I'm going to examine your abdomen now. It may hurt, but I need to determine what's causing your pain." His hands were warm and surprisingly gentle as they probed her side, but even his careful touch sent lightning bolts of agony through her body. She bit back a scream, her hands fisting in the sheet beneath her. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his face grave as he felt the rigid muscles of her abdomen. "I know it hurts, but I'm almost finished." When he finally stepped back, his expression was grim. Alvara tried to read his face, but medical training had taught him to mask his emotions well. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Dr. Cobburn pulled a chair close to the examination table and sat down, his brown eyes serious but kind. "Miss Trenholm, I believe you're suffering from acute appendicitis. The appendix is a small organ attached to your intestines, and when it becomes inflamed—" "How bad is it?" Alvara interrupted, not wanting to hear a long medical explanation. She needed facts, not lectures. "Without treatment, it's life-threatening," he said bluntly. "The appendix could rupture at any time, and if it does—" He didn't need to finish. Alvara had seen men die from belly wounds during her childhood, had watched them linger in agony for days before finally succumbing. The thought of dying that way, slowly and painfully, made her stomach clench with terror. "What kind of treatment?" she asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "Surgery," Dr. Cobburn said. "I need to remove the appendix before it ruptures. It's a relatively simple procedure, but it needs to be done soon." Surgery. The word hit Alvara like a physical blow. Surgery meant being completely helpless, unconscious, and vulnerable while this stranger cut into her body. It meant trusting him not just with her health, but with her life. "No," she said, struggling to sit up. "No, there has to be another way. Medicine, something." "Miss Trenholm, please," Dr. Cobburn said, gently pushing her back down. "There is no other treatment for appendicitis. If we wait much longer—" I said no. The words came out as a shout fueled by men and terror and a lifetime of relying only on herself. "I won't let you cut me open like some animal." Dr. Cobburn was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those perceptive brown eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was soft but firm. "You're afraid," he said simply. The accusation hit too close to home, making Alvara's defenses flare up like a cornered wildcat. "I'm not afraid of anything." "Everyone's afraid of something," Dr. Cobburn replied calmly. "Surgery is frightening, especially for someone who's used to being in control. But fear is not a luxury you can afford right now. You don't know anything about me." Alvara spat, though even arguing was exhausting her. "You don't know what I can and can't afford." "You're right," he admitted. "I don't know your story, but I know pain when I see it, and I know fear, and I know stubborn pride that's going to get someone killed if they're not careful." His words stung because they were true. Alvara had built her entire identity around being strong, independent, unbreakable. The idea of lying helpless on an operating table while someone else held her life in their hands went against everything she believed about herself. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're just some Eastern doctor who probably never had to fight for anything in his life." Something flickered across Dr. Cobburn's face, pain, maybe, or old anger. For a moment his professional mask slipped and she caught a glimpse of something deeper. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "I am from the East, Boston to be specific, and you're right that I haven't had to fight the same battles you have. But that doesn't mean I haven't had battles of my own." He was quiet for a moment, seeming to wrestle with how much to reveal. Finally, he continued, "I came here because I needed to start over, Miss Trenholm, because sometimes the thing that's killing you isn't a diseased organ. Sometimes it's a life that doesn't fit expectations. You can't meet people who see you as nothing more than a disappointment." The raw honesty in his voice caught Alvara off guard. She'd expected defensiveness, maybe anger at her accusations. Instead, he was offering her a glimpse of his own vulnerability. "I know what it's like to have everyone expect you to be something you're not," he continued, "and I know what it's like to run from that, to try to prove yourself in a place where nobody knows your history or your failures. But I also know that running doesn't solve anything if you're just going to die from stubbornness in the process." Despite her pain and fear, Alvara found herself really looking at him for the first time. Beneath the polished exterior and expensive clothes, she saw something she recognized, the carefully controlled expression of someone who'd learned to hide their wounds behind competence and professional distance. "What did you run from?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Dr. Coburn's smile was rueful. "My father wanted me to be a society doctor, treating wealthy matrons for imaginary ailments and charging outrageous fees for the privilege. My fiancée wanted me to be a proper Boston gentleman who would provide her with a life of parties and social status. Neither of them particularly cared what I wanted." "What did you want?" "To actually help people," he said simply. "To use my skills for something that mattered. When I told them I was thinking about going west to practice frontier medicine, they both made it very clear that such a choice would be unacceptable." So you left anyway. So I left anyway, he confirmed. Lost the fiancé, disappointed the father, shocked all the proper Boston society doctors who thought I'd lost my mind. But I'd rather be a disappointment living the life I chose than a success living the life someone else chose for me. The pain in Alvara's side flared again, but she barely noticed it. Dr. Coburn's words had struck something deep inside her, a recognition of kindred spirit she hadn't expected to find. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I think you understand what it means to fight for the right to be yourself," he said. "And I think you're smart enough to know that dying from pride isn't brave, it's just wasteful." Before Alvara could respond, another wave of pain hit her, this one so intense that she cried out involuntarily. Dr. Cobburn was beside her instantly, his hand cool on her fevered forehead. "Miss Trenholm, we're running out of time," he said urgently. "Your temperature is rising, which means infection is setting in. If the appendix ruptures—" "I know," she gasped, tears streaming down her face from the pain. "I know what happens." "Then let me help you," he pleaded. "Just lay back and let me take care of this. Let me save your life." There it was again, those words that seemed to reach right into her soul and twist everything she thought she knew about herself. Let me take care of you. Such a simple concept, but one that went against every survival instinct she'd developed. Through the haze of pain and fever, Alvara found herself thinking about her father. Samuel Trenholm had been the strongest man she'd ever known, but even he had understood when to accept help. He'd taken partners when he needed them, hired hands when the work was too much for one man, even accepted loans when times were tough. The difference was that he'd seen help as a tool to be used wisely, not a sign of weakness. Maybe strength wasn't about never needing anyone. Maybe it was about being smart enough to know when you did. She started, then had to pause as another contraction of pain gripped her. "If I do this, if I let you operate, what are the chances?" Dr. Coburn's expression was grave but honest. "If we do it now before rupture, your chances are very good. Probably 90% or better, but if we wait much longer—" He didn't need to finish. They both knew that a ruptured appendix meant infection, sepsis, and almost certain death even with surgical intervention. "And if I don't?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "You'll be dead within days," he said bluntly. "Maybe hours if it ruptures soon." The choice, when stripped of all pride and pretense, wasn't really a choice at all. She could live and accept help or die and maintain her independence. Put that way, the decision was obvious, but that didn't make it any easier. "I've never—" she began, then stopped embarrassed by what she'd been about to admit. "Never what?" "Never been unconscious around someone I didn't trust completely," she finished quietly. "Never been that vulnerable." Dr. Coburn's expression softened with understanding. "I know, and I know this is asking a lot, but I give you my word, Miss Trenholm, I will take care of you. I will guard your vulnerability as carefully as I guard your life." Something in his tone, in the way he looked at her, made Alvara believe him. Maybe it was the fever talking, or maybe it was the recognition of someone else who understood what it meant to be an outsider fighting for acceptance. Either way, she found herself nodding slowly. "All right," she whispered. "Do it." Relief flooded Dr. Coburn's face. "Thank you," he said softly. "You won't regret this." "I better not." Alvara managed, trying for her usual tough tone but falling short. "Because if I die on your table, I'm coming back to haunt you." Dr. Coburn's smile was the first genuinely warm expression she'd seen from him. "I'll hold you to that threat, Miss Trenholm. Now let me go explain the situation to Mr. Santos, and then we'll get started." As he left the room, Alvara closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for the most terrifying thing she'd ever done, letting go of control completely and trusting her life to someone else's hands. When Miguel returned with the doctor, his weathered face was tight with worry, but determined with resolve. The doctor explained everything. he said, taking her hand in his calloused grip. "You're doing the right thing, mija. Your papa, he would be proud of you for being smart enough to accept help when you need it." "Will you?" Alvara's voice caught, and she had to try again. "Will you stay until it's over?" "Try and make me leave," Miguel said firmly. "I'll be right here when you wake up." Cobburn had returned with medical supplies and what looked like a bottle of chloroform. The sight of it made Alvara's heart race with panic. "I'm going to give you something to make you sleep," he explained, his voice gentle but professional. "When you wake up, this will all be over, and you'll be on the road to recovery." "Wait," Alvara said, suddenly grabbing his wrist as he approached with the chloroform-soaked cloth. "What about the ranch? The banknote comes due in 2 weeks." "Don't worry about that now," Miguel said firmly. "We'll figure something out. Right now, the only thing that matters is getting you well." But Alvara couldn't let it go. The ranch was everything: her family's legacy, her identity, her reason for existing. If she lost it while she was laid up recovering from surgery— "Promise me," she said urgently, looking between Miguel and Dr. Cobburn. "Promise me you won't let them take the ranch while I'm unconscious. Whatever happens, don't let them take it." "I promise," Miguel said immediately, though she could see the worry in his eyes. They both knew that 2 weeks wasn't much time to come up with $2,500. Dr. Cobburn looked puzzled by the exchange, but he nodded as well. "Your ranch will be waiting for you when you recover, Miss Trenholm. You have my word." With those promises echoing in her ears, Alvara finally allowed herself to relax slightly. The chloroform cloth descended toward her face, and she caught one last glimpse of Dr. Coburn's serious brown eyes. "Just lay back," he murmured, echoing his earlier words, "and let me take care of you." As consciousness faded, Alvara's last coherent thought was that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally met someone worthy of her trust. Someone who saw her not as a problem to be solved or a challenge to be conquered, but as a person worth saving. The darkness that followed was complete and dreamless, but for the first time in weeks, it was also peaceful. The constant pain that had been her companion was finally blissfully gone, replaced by the quiet certainty that she was, for once in her life, truly safe. In the outer room, Miguel Santos sat in a hard wooden chair and prayed to every saint he could remember, while behind the closed door, Dr. Jarth Cobburn worked with steady hands and fierce determination to save the life of the most stubborn, prideful, magnificent woman he'd ever encountered. Neither of them knew yet that this moment would mark the beginning of something extraordinary, a love story that would prove stronger than pride, deeper than fear, and more enduring than the harsh frontier that had shaped them both. But somewhere in the space between conscious and unconscious, between trust and terror, between the old Alvara, who needed no one, and the new Alvara, who was learning to accept help, the first seeds of that love were already taking root. The surgery lasted 3 hours, and when it was over, Dr. Cobburn emerged exhausted but triumphant. The appendix had been on the verge of rupturing, but he'd removed it cleanly, and Alvara's strong constitution was already fighting off the infection. "She's going to be fine," he told Miguel, who had worn a groove in the wooden floor from his pacing. "The next few days will be difficult, but she's going to recover completely." Miguel's relief was so profound that he had to sit down heavily, his legs suddenly weak. "Gracias, doctor," he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Gracias a Dios." But as Dr. Cobburn watched over his unconscious patient through the long night that followed, he found himself thinking not about the successful surgery, but about the moment when this fierce, independent woman had finally trusted him enough to let go. He'd performed hundreds of operations, saved countless lives, but something about Alvara Trenholm was different. Something about the way she'd looked at him when she'd finally said yes, the vulnerability she'd shown him despite every instinct screaming against it. As dawn broke over Bitter Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Dr. Jarth Cobburn admitted to himself what he'd been trying to deny since the moment she'd first walked into his office. He was falling in love with the most impossible woman in Texas, and judging by the way his heart raced every time she stirred in her sleep, every time her breathing changed or her eyelids fluttered, he was already in deeper than he'd ever intended to go. The only question now was whether a stubborn cowgirl and a displaced Eastern doctor could find common ground somewhere between her fierce independence and his growing need to protect her. Time would tell, but as Dr. Cobburn settled into the chair beside Alvara's bed to continue his vigil, he found himself hoping with a fervor that surprised him. Hoping that when she woke up she might see him not as the enemy of her independence, but as someone who could be trusted with both her vulnerabilities and her strength. Someone who might, if she'd let him spend the rest of his life proving that love didn't have to mean the end of freedom, it could mean the beginning of something even better. The first thing Alvara became aware of was the absence of pain. For weeks, agony had been her constant companion, a grinding presence that colored every waking moment. Now, as consciousness slowly returned, she found herself floating in a strange, peaceful void where her body felt light and free. The second thing she noticed was the sound of voices, two men speaking in low, urgent tones somewhere nearby. Her mind was still clouded with the lingering effects of chloroform, but gradually the words began to make sense. "Bank representatives were here this morning," Miguel's voice tight with worry. "They're not willing to extend the deadline. 10 days, that's all we have left." "Surely they can see she's been seriously ill." Dr. Coburn's voice edged with anger. "What kind of men would foreclose on a woman while she's unconscious from surgery? The kind who smell weakness and circle like vultures." Miguel replied bitterly. "They've been waiting for this chance. A woman running a ranch alone was always going to be a target." Alvara tried to open her eyes to tell them she was awake, but her eyelids felt impossibly heavy. The medication was still holding her in its grip, keeping her suspended between waking and sleeping. "There has to be something we can do," Dr. Cobburn said. "Some way to buy more time. Not without money we don't have." Miguel sighed. "I've been over the books a dozen times. Even if we sold every head of cattle, we'd still be short. The drought hit us too hard and the prices—" His voice trailed off and Alvara could hear the defeat in it. This was her worst nightmare, lying helpless while everything she'd worked for slipped away. The ranch that had been in her family for generations was about to be lost because she'd been too proud to seek help when she first needed it. "What about selling part of the land?" Dr. Cobburn suggested. "Keep the core of the ranch but sell off some of the outer sections." "She'd never agree to that," Miguel said immediately. "Every acre of this place is sacred to her. It's not just land, it's her identity, her purpose, everything she is." "Then we need to find another solution." The determination in Dr. Coburn's voice surprised Alvara. Why would he care what happened to her ranch? He barely knew her, had no stake in her problems. Yet he sounded as invested in finding a solution as Miguel did. "I wish we could, doctor, but I've exhausted every option. The bank won't negotiate, the other ranchers are offering pennies on the dollar, and we don't have anything left to sell that would make a real difference." Silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of impending loss. Alvara wanted to speak, to tell them she was awake and thinking, but her body still refused to cooperate fully. "There might be one possibility," Dr. Cobburn said slowly, as if the idea was just forming as he spoke. "It's unconventional, but—" "What? Alone, from me." Miguel's sharp intake of breath was audible even through Alvara's drugged haze. "Doctor, that's generous of you, but we couldn't accept—" "Why not?" Dr. Coburn's voice was gaining strength conviction. "I have the money sitting in a Boston bank earning modest interest, while I decide what to do with my life. At least this way, it would be put to good use." "But the risk—" "What risk, Miss Trenholm, strikes me as someone who honors her debts. And if the ranch fails, well, the land itself has value. It's not charity, Mr. Santos, it's an investment." Alvara's heart raced at his words. He was offering to save her ranch, to give her the chance to keep everything she held dear, but the cost, owing that kind of money to Dr. Cobburn, would tie her to him in ways that terrified her almost as much as losing the ranch. "I don't know," Miguel said, uncertainty. "Alvara, she's proud, taking money from a stranger." "I'm not a stranger anymore," Dr. Cobburn said quietly. "She trusted me with her life yesterday. Maybe she'll trust me with her ranch today." The simple statement hit Alvara like a physical blow. He was right in agreeing to the surgery. She had trusted him with the most precious thing she possessed. Her life was no less valuable than her land, and she'd already placed it in his hands. But financial debt was different. Medical treatment was a necessity, a transaction between doctor and patient. What he was proposing would create a personal obligation that could last for years. She managed to crack her eyes open slightly, squinting against the afternoon light filtering through the window of Dr. Cobburn's office. Both men were seated near her makeshift bed. Miguel, in his familiar work clothes, Dr. Cobburn still wearing the blood-stained shirt from her surgery. "How long?" she croaked, her voice barely audible. Both men were on their feet instantly, Dr. Cobburn reaching for a glass of water while Miguel leaned over her with relief written across his weathered features. "Thank God," Miguel breathed. "We've been so worried." Dr. Cobburn helped her sit up slightly, supporting her with one arm while holding the water glass to her lips with the other. The cool liquid felt like heaven on her parched throat. "How long have I been unconscious?" she managed to ask more clearly. "About 18 hours, Dr. Cobburn said, his professional mask sliding back into place as he checked her pulse. "The surgery went well. I was able to remove the appendix before it ruptured, and there are no signs of infection." Alvara nodded, then looked directly at him. "I heard you talking about the loan." Both men looked uncomfortable, as if they'd been caught discussing her private business, which she supposed they had been. "Alvara," Miguel started, "we were just trying to save my ranch while I was unconscious," she finished. "I understand. The question is, Dr. Cobburn, why would you want to involve yourself in my problems?" Dr. Cobburn set down the water glass and met her gaze directly. "Because watching you lose everything you've worked for while you recover from surgery I performed seems like a particularly cruel injustice." "That's not really an answer." He was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "You're right. The honest answer is that I admire what you've built here, and I hate the idea of men like those bank representatives profiting from your misfortune." It was a good answer, noble even, but Alvara sensed there was more to it. Something in the way he looked at her, the careful attention he'd paid to her well-being beyond what mere professional duty required. "What would be the terms?" she asked, ignoring Miguel's sharp look of surprise. "Standard interest rates payable over whatever time frame works for your operation. No prepayment penalties, and if circumstances change..." He paused as if reconsidering his words. "We can always renegotiate if necessary. And collateral. The ranch itself, same as the bank would require, but I'd be much more flexible in my enforcement policies." Alvara studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden motives. What she saw was earnest concern mixed with something else, something that made her pulse quicken despite her weakened condition. "Why should I trust you?" she asked bluntly. "Because yesterday you trusted me with your life," he replied simply. "And because I give you my word that I have no interest in taking your ranch from you. What I'm interested in..." He stopped abruptly, as if he'd been about to say something he wasn't ready to reveal. "What?" Alvara pressed. Dr. Cobburn glanced at Miguel, then back at her. "What I'm interested in is seeing you succeed on your own terms. You've built something remarkable here, and it would be a tragedy to see it destroyed by circumstances beyond your control." The words were carefully neutral, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. This wasn't just about money or business. This was personal for him in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course, but..." Cobburn hesitated. The bank representatives seemed quite eager to finalize things quickly. "We may not have much time." Miguel spoke up for the first time since she'd awakened. "Mija, I know this is difficult, but we're out of other options. And Dr. Cobburn, he's offering fair terms." "More than a fair," Alvara admitted grudgingly. "But accepting his help would mean—" She couldn't finish the thought aloud, but both men seemed to understand. Accepting this loan would create a connection between her and Dr. Cobburn that went far beyond the professional relationship they'd established. It would make him a part of her life, her struggles, her future, in ways that she'd never allowed anyone before. "It would mean you could keep your ranch," Dr. Cobburn said quietly. "Everything else we can figure out as we go." The simple statement carried layers of meaning that made Alvara's heart race. He wasn't just offering to save her property, he was offering to be part of whatever came next. And despite every instinct screaming warnings about the dangers of letting someone get that close, she found herself wanting to say yes. "I'll consider it," she said finally, "but right now I need to rest." Dr. Cobburn nodded immediately. "Of course, you need several more days of recovery before you should even think about going home. We can discuss the details when you're feeling stronger." As he and Miguel moved away from her bedside to continue their discussion, in whispers, Alvara closed her eyes and tried to process everything that had changed in the space of a single day. Yesterday morning, she'd been a dying woman facing the loss of everything she held dear. Now she was on the road to recovery with an offer that could save her ranch if she was brave enough to accept help from a man who was already occupying far too much space in her thoughts. The next 3 days passed in a blur of gradual healing and careful conversations. Dr. Cobburn checked on her regularly, monitoring her recovery with professional efficiency, but Alvara caught him watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with medicine. For her part, she found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that worried her. Miguel rode back and forth between the ranch and town, keeping her updated on the cattle and fielding increasingly aggressive inquiries from the bank's representatives. Each day brought them closer to the deadline, and each day made Dr. Coburn's offer seem more like her only salvation. It was on the 4th morning after her surgery that everything came to a head. Alvara was sitting up in bed, finally feeling strong enough to think clearly when raised voices from the front office caught her attention. "Told you she's recovering from surgery." Miguel's voice angry and defensive. "That's unfortunate, but business is business," an unfamiliar voice replied coldly. "The note comes due in 6 days. If Miss Trenholm can't meet her obligations, she's been unconscious for 4 days. Dr. Coburn's voice sharp with outrage. "Again, unfortunate, but not our concern. Perhaps she should have thought about that before letting her medical condition interfere with her financial responsibilities." Alvara felt rage surge through her, stronger than any pain the surgery had caused. The casual cruelty of the man's words, the implication that nearly dying had been a choice on her part, ignited every fierce instinct she possessed. She swung her legs out of bed, ignoring the pull of her healing incision, and reached for the clothes Miguel had brought from the ranch. Getting dressed was an ordeal that left her dizzy and weak, but determination drove her forward. When she walked into the front office, all conversation stopped. The 2 bank representatives, soft, pale men in expensive suits, looked startled to see her up and moving. Miguel looked worried, while Dr. Cobburn appeared torn between professional concern and obvious admiration for her stubborn refusal to stay down. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady despite her weakness, "I understand you're eager to discuss my financial obligations." The older of the 2 men, a thin creature with calculating eyes, stepped forward. "Miss Trenholm, we were just explaining to your associates that illness doesn't suspend the terms of your loan agreement." "No, it doesn't," Alvara agreed, "but it also doesn't give you the right to harass my people while I'm recovering from surgery. If you have business with me, conduct it with me." Very well, the man said, his tone suggesting he found this development amusing. The Cattleman's Investment Group now holds your note, and we require full payment within 6 days. $2,500 plus accrued interest. And if I can't pay, the man's smile was coldly satisfied. Then we foreclose immediately. The ranch will be sold at auction to recover our investment. Alvara felt the words hit her like physical blows, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. These men fed on weakness, and she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her desperation. I see, she said calmly, and I suppose you already have buyers lined up for the auction. As a matter of fact, there has been considerable interest in your property. Several parties have made inquiries about purchasing it should foreclosure become necessary. The implications were clear. This wasn't just business, it was a carefully orchestrated land grab designed to force her into an impossible situation and then profit from her failure. Well, gentlemen, Alvara said, straightening to her full height, despite the protest from her healing body. I'm afraid I have some disappointing news for you. Both men looked puzzled, as if they couldn't imagine what she might say that could possibly disappoint them. The loan will be paid in full, she continued, her voice gaining strength. You won't be foreclosing on my ranch. Miss Trenholm, the younger man interjected. We've reviewed your finances. You don't have the resources. You've reviewed my old finances, Alvara corrected. Circumstances have changed. She looked directly at Dr. Cobburn, who was watching her with an expression of barely contained hope. Dr. Cobburn, she said formally, I'd like to accept your generous offer of a loan to cover my outstanding debts. The relief that flooded his face was so profound that it took her breath away. Of course, Miss Trenholm, I can have the funds transferred immediately. The two bank representatives looked stunned, as if the possibility of someone else offering her assistance had never occurred to them. Now see here, the older man blustered, you can't just what? Alvara asked pleasantly. Pay my debts to avoid foreclosure. I believe that's exactly what loan agreements are designed to allow. Dr. Cobburn stepped forward, his professional manner giving way to something more personal and protective. Gentlemen, Miss Trenholm will have your payment within 48 hours. I trust that will be satisfactory. The two men exchanged glances, clearly unhappy with this turn of events, but unable to object to receiving their money as agreed. Fine, the older man said coldly. 48 hours, but if the payment is even 1 day late, it won't be, Dr. Cobburn said with quiet certainty. After the men left, an awkward silence fell over the room. Alvara suddenly felt the full weight of what she'd just committed to, not just the financial obligation, but the personal one. By accepting Dr. Cobburn's help so publicly, she'd tied their fates together in ways that went far beyond a simple business transaction. Miguel was the first to break the silence. I'll head back to the ranch, start getting the paperwork together for the loan transfer. Doctor, thank you, more than I can say. After Miguel left, Alvara found herself alone with Dr. Cobburn for the first time since she'd made her decision. The air between them felt charged with unspoken possibilities and unexplored emotions. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Accept my offer so publicly, I mean. It puts you in an awkward position if you'd changed your mind. I hadn't changed my mind, Dr. Cobburn replied. The question is, are you sure about this? Once the paperwork is signed, we'll be connected in ways that might make you uncomfortable. Connected. Such a simple word for such a complicated reality. By accepting his money, she was accepting him into her life in ways that went far beyond their doctor-patient relationship. Are you asking if I trust you? She said. I suppose I am. Alvara looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the honest concern in his brown eyes, the way his hands moved with confident precision, the careful attention he'd paid to her well-being even when she'd been difficult and ungrateful. 3 days ago, I would have said I didn't trust anyone, she admitted. But you've proven yourself to be a man of your word. When you said you'd take care of me, you did. When you promised to save my life, you did. I have no reason to believe you won't honor this agreement as well." "And beyond the business arrangement," he asked quietly, "what about the other implications?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibilities neither of them was quite ready to name. Alvara felt her pulse quicken as she considered what he might be asking and what her answer might be. "I don't know," she said honestly. "This is all new territory for me. I've never owed anyone anything before, never had to consider how my decisions might affect someone else's interests." "It's new for me too," Dr. Cobburn admitted. "I've never had a personal stake in someone else's success before, never cared so much about the outcome." The admission sent warmth flooding through Alvara's chest. He did care, not just as a doctor or even as a friend, but as someone who had developed feelings for her that went deeper than professional concern. "What are we doing here, Dr. Cobburn?" she asked softly. "I think," he said, moving closer to her, "we're figuring it out as we go, and I think you should call me Jarth." "Jarth," she repeated, testing the sound of his name on her tongue. It felt intimate, personal, like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. "Alvara," he said in return, and the way he said her name made her shiver with something that had nothing to do with her recent illness. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other with new understanding. The loan was just the beginning, they both knew that. Now, what came next would depend on whether they were brave enough to explore the connection that had been building between them since that first day in his office. "I should rest," Alvara said finally, though what she really needed was space to think about everything that was changing between them. "You should," Jarth agreed, but he made no move to step away from her. "Jarth, yes, thank you for everything. I know you didn't have to help me, and I'm grateful." "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "Taking care of you isn't a burden, Alvara. It's a privilege." The word sent heat rushing through her body, and she had to look away before she did something foolish, like reach for him. This was happening too fast, too intensely, and she needed time to process the magnitude of what was changing between them. But as she made her way back to her bed, she could feel his eyes on her, and she knew that whatever came next, there was no going back to the simple doctor-patient relationship they'd started with. The loan would save her ranch, but Jarth Cobburn himself might prove to be an even greater force of change in her carefully ordered life. And for the first time since her father's death, Alvara found herself looking forward to the future instead of simply enduring it. The paperwork was signed on a crisp morning 2 weeks later, with autumn painting the Texas landscape in shades of gold and amber. Alvara sat across from Jarth at the small table in his office, her hands surprisingly steady as she wrote her name on the loan documents that would keep her ranch in the family for another generation. The scratching of her pen seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room, marking not just a financial transaction but a fundamental shift in her carefully guarded independence. "There," she said, setting down the pen and looking up at Jarth. "It's done." "It's done," he agreed, but his eyes held an expression that suggested this was more of a beginning than an ending. The bank representatives had left an hour ago, their faces sour with disappointment as they collected their payment and relinquished their claim on her property. Miguel had been practically dancing with relief as he'd watched them ride away, muttering Spanish prayers of gratitude under his breath. Now, with the immediate crisis resolved, Alvara found herself facing a new and entirely different set of challenges. She owed Jarth Cobburn $2,500 plus interest, but more importantly, she owed him a debt of gratitude that could never be fully repaid. The question that had been haunting her for days was what exactly he expected in return. "I should get back to the ranch," she said, rising from her chair. The movement still caused a twinge of discomfort from her healing incision, but she was stronger now, more herself than she'd been in weeks. "Are you sure you're ready?" Jarth asked, concern creeping into his voice. "It's only been 2 weeks since the surgery. Perhaps you should take things slowly for a while longer." "I've been taking things slowly long enough," Alvara replied, though not unkindly. "Miguel's been handling everything on his own, and that's not fair to him. Besides, I need to see the place, make sure everything's still standing." What she didn't say was that she needed space to think, to process everything that had happened between them. The intensity of her feelings for this man was becoming harder to ignore, and the close quarters of his office only made it worse. Jarth seemed to understand her unspoken need for distance. "Of course, but I'd like to check on your recovery in a few days, make sure everything's healing properly." "That's not necessary." "It's medical protocol," he said firmly, though the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth suggested his motivations weren't entirely professional. Before Alvara could argue further, Miguel appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, and looking eager to depart. "The horses are ready, Alvara. Thunder's been missing you something fierce." The ride back to the ranch was a revelation. After weeks of being confined to a sickbed, the feeling of wind in her hair and sun on her face was intoxicating. Thunder pranced beneath her, clearly happy to have his mistress back in the saddle, and even the familiar ache in her healing side couldn't dampen Alvara's spirits. But as they crested the hill that gave them their first clear view of the ranch, her euphoria faded into concern. The place looked smaller, somehow more vulnerable than she remembered. The cattle in the visible pastures were fewer and thinner, and several sections of fence showed signs of neglect. "How bad is it?" she asked Miguel quietly. "Could be worse," he said diplomatically. "We lost 3 more head to wolves last week, and the north pasture fence needs major repairs before winter. But the core herd is healthy, and we've got enough feed stored to last until spring, if we're careful." Alvara nodded, her mind already calculating costs and priorities. The loan from Jarth had solved her immediate financial crisis, but it hadn't magically restored her ranch to prosperity. She still had months of hard work ahead of her to get the operation back on solid footing. The ranch house looked smaller, too, somehow shabbier than it had in her memory. The front porch sagged slightly, and paint was peeling from the window frames. How long had she been ignoring these signs of decline, focusing on the immediate crisis, while the foundation of her life slowly crumbled around her? "Welcome home, mija," Miguel said softly as they dismounted in front of the house. Home. The word should have filled her with comfort and satisfaction, but instead it carried the weight of new obligations. This wasn't just her refuge anymore, it was collateral on a loan security for a debt that connected her irrevocably to a man she was trying very hard not to think about. That evening, as she sat on her front porch, watching the sun set over her land, Alvara allowed herself a moment of honest reflection. The ranch was saved, her health was restored, and she had more resources at her disposal than she'd had in years. By any reasonable measure, she should be happy. So why did she feel so unsettled? The answer came to her as she watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. For the first time in her adult life, her fate was tied to someone else's decisions. Jarth had been generous with the loan terms, but he was still her creditor. If her cattle prices fell, if another drought hit, if any of a dozen potential disasters befell the ranch, she would have to answer to him. More troubling was the way her thoughts kept drifting to memories of his gentle hands during her recovery, the sound of his voice when he'd promised to take care of her, the way he'd looked at her when she'd accepted his offer. Those weren't the thoughts of a woman conducting a simple business transaction. "You're brooding," Miguel observed, settling into the chair beside her with his customary evening cup of coffee. "I'm thinking." "Same thing with you." He was quiet for a moment, studying her profile in the fading light. "You want to talk about what's really bothering you?" Alvara considered deflecting, giving him some practical concern about cattle or finances, but Miguel had known her since she was a child, had watched her grow from a stubborn girl into an even more stubborn woman. He would see through any evasion. "I don't know how to be indebted to someone," she said finally. "My whole life I've made my own way. Even when Papa was alive, I earned my place here through work, not charity. This feels like you owe him more than money. The observation hit closer to home than Alvara was comfortable admitting. Something like that. Miguel chuckled, a sound rich with understanding and affection. Mija, that man didn't loan you money because he's running a charity. He did it because he cares about you. There's a difference. That's what makes it complicated. No, Miguel said gently, that's what makes it simple. The question isn't whether you owe him something, it's whether you care about him too. Alvara felt heat rise in her cheeks. Miguel, I'm old, not blind, he continued. I saw the way you two looked at each other, heard the way his voice changed when he talked about you. And I saw the way you fought your feelings every step of the way, like caring about someone was some kind of weakness. Isn't it? The words came out more vulnerable than she'd intended. Miguel's expression softened with paternal concern. Your papa, God rest his soul, he loved your mama with everything he had, made him stronger, not weaker, gave him something worth fighting for beyond just survival. And when she died, it nearly broke him, Miguel admitted. But even then he said he'd rather have loved her and lost her than never loved her at all. Love isn't weakness, Alvara. Fear of love, that's weakness. His words echoed in her mind long after he'd retired for the evening. Fear of love. Was that what had been driving her resistance to Jarth's kindness, her discomfort with accepting his help? Not pride in her independence, but terror of the vulnerability that came with caring about someone. The next morning brought a return to familiar routines that should have been comforting but felt oddly hollow. Alvara rode out to check on the cattle-inspected fences, reviewed the ranch's accounts, and made plans for the work that needed to be done before winter. All the tasks that had once defined her purpose felt somehow incomplete now, as if she was going through the motions of a life that no longer quite fit. It was near noon when she heard hoofbeats approaching the house. From the window of the ranch office, she watched Jarth ride up on a rented horse, his eastern clothes dusty from the journey, but his posture confident in the saddle. Despite herself, her pulse quickened at the sight of him. Medical house call, he announced when she met him at the front door, though his smile suggested this visit was as much personal as professional. I told you that wasn't necessary, Alvara said, but she stepped aside to let him enter. Humor me, Jarth replied, setting his medical bag on the kitchen table. It's been 3 days since I checked on your recovery. How are you feeling? Fine, she said automatically, then caught his skeptical look. Stronger every day. The incision is healing well, and I haven't had any complications. Show me. The request caught her off guard. In his office, surrounded by medical equipment and professional atmosphere, examination had felt clinical. Here in her own kitchen, with afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, and the intimate quiet of her home around them, the idea of lifting her shirt for his inspection felt dangerously personal. Jarth, I don't think I'm your doctor, Alvara, he said gently, and your health is too important to leave to guesswork. Reluctantly, she turned away from him and lifted the hem of her shirt just enough to expose the healing incision site. She heard his footsteps approach, felt the warmth of his body as he moved close behind her. This looks excellent, he murmured, his fingers gentle as he examined the nearly healed wound. No signs of infection, minimal scarring. You're healing beautifully. The professional assessment was reassuring, but the way his voice had softened on the word beautifully sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with medical evaluation. When he didn't immediately step away, she became acutely aware of his proximity, the sound of his breathing, the subtle scent of soap and leather that seemed to surround him. Jarth, she whispered, not sure if she was warning him away or asking him to come closer. His hands stilled on her skin, and she could feel the tension radiating from him. For a moment, neither of them moved, suspended in a moment of possibility that could change everything between them. Then Jarth stepped back, his hands falling away from her body, and Alvara immediately felt the loss of his warmth. You're healing perfectly, he said, his voice carefully professional once more. No restrictions on your activities, though I'd still recommend avoiding heavy lifting for another week or so." Alvara pulled her shirt back down and turned to face him, struggling to read the expression in his brown eyes. "Thank you for the medical attention and everything else. You don't need to keep thanking me." "Yes, I do," she said firmly. "What you did, the loan, it saved everything I care about. I know you said it was just business, but we both know it was more than that." Jarth was quiet for a long moment, seeming to wrestle with how much honesty their relationship could bear. "You're right," he said finally. "It was more than business. The question is, what do we do about that?" The directness of his question took her breath away. Here was the conversation she'd been avoiding, the acknowledgement of the feelings that had been building between them since that first day in his office. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been in this situation before." "What situation? Caring about someone who has power over my life?" she said bluntly. "You hold the note on my ranch, Jarth. If I can't make the payments, if something goes wrong, you think I'd foreclose on you?" His voice carried a hurt that made her immediately regret her words. "I think you're human," she said more gently. "And humans change their minds, their feelings, their priorities. What happens between us if the attraction fades, but the debt remains?" Jarth stepped closer to her, his eyes intense with conviction. "Alvara, look at me. Do you really believe I'm the kind of man who would use a loan as leverage in a personal relationship?" She wanted to say no immediately, but years of self-protection made her hesitate. The pause was apparently answer enough for Jarth, whose expression shifted from hurt to resignation. "I see," he said quietly. "You don't trust me." "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," he interrupted. "Either you trust me to separate business from personal feelings, or you don't. Either you believe I'm a man of honor, or you think I'm someone who would manipulate you through financial obligation." The stark choice he presented forced Alvara to confront the real source of her resistance. It wasn't fear of his character. Everything she'd observed about Jarth Cobburn suggested he was exactly the honorable man he claimed to be. Her fear ran deeper than that, to the fundamental terror of needing someone so much that losing them would destroy her. "I do trust you," she said softly. "That's what scares me." The admission seemed to surprise them both. Jarth's expression softened immediately, understanding, replacing hurt in his eyes. "Alvara, I've never needed anyone before." She continued, the words tumbling out now that she'd started. "Never had to consider someone else's feelings when making decisions about my life. Never had to worry about disappointing someone or being disappointed by them. And now you're here and you've saved my ranch and probably my life, and I find myself thinking about you at the most inconvenient times, and I don't know what to do with any of it." Jarth's smile was gentle and understanding. "Would it help if I told you I'm just as confused as you are?" "Are you?" "Completely," he admitted. "I came to Texas to escape complications, to practice medicine in a place where my personal life couldn't interfere with my professional responsibilities. The last thing I expected was to meet a woman who would make me question everything I thought I wanted." His honesty was disarming, making her feel less alone in her confusion. "What do you think you want now?" "You," he said simply. "I want you, Alvara, not as a patient, not as a business associate, but as a woman I'm falling in love with, despite every logical reason why I shouldn't be." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her heart race. Love. He'd said love, not attraction or affection or any of the safer words they'd been dancing around. "Jarth," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I know it's too soon, too complicated, too risky for both of us," he continued. "But I also know that what I feel for you isn't going to disappear just because it's inconvenient. So the question is, what do we do about it?" Alvara stared at him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering. Not just love, but the courage to act on it despite all the practical obstacles in their path. "I don't know how to love someone," she said honestly. "I don't know how to be part of a pair instead of just myself." "Neither do I," Jarth admitted. "My last relationship ended because I couldn't be the man she wanted me to be. I don't know if I can be the man you need either. What if we disappoint each other? What if we don't?" The simple counter-question hung in the air between them, representing a leap of faith that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked carefully. "Honesty," Jarth said. "No more pretending this is just business between us. No more avoiding the fact that we care about each other. And time to figure out if what we feel is real enough to build something lasting on." "And the loan is separate," he said firmly. "Whatever happens between us personally, I will honor the terms we agreed to. You have my word on that." Alvara studied his face, looking for any sign of uncertainty or deception. What she saw was a man as scared and hopeful as she was, offering her something she'd never had before: partnership instead of solitude. "All right," she said, the words coming out as barely a whisper. All right, let's try honesty," she said more clearly. "Let's try this, whatever this is." The relief that flooded Jarth's features was so profound that it took her breath away. In that moment she realized how much her answer had mattered to him, how much courage it had taken for him to make himself vulnerable to her potential rejection. "Thank you," he said softly. Before she could lose her nerve, Alvara stepped closer to him, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Jarth, yes, kiss me." The request seemed to surprise them both, but Jarth didn't hesitate. His hands came up to frame her face, gentle but sure, and then his lips were on hers, warm and soft and perfect. The kiss was nothing like she'd imagined a first kiss would be. There was no desperate passion or overwhelming emotion. Instead, it was tender and sweet, full of promise and possibility. When they finally broke apart, Alvara felt fundamentally changed, as if some essential piece of herself that had been missing had finally clicked into place. "That was," she began, then trailed off, unable to find words for the feeling. "Nice," Jarth finished, his voice slightly breathless. "Very nice." They stood there for a moment, looking at each other with new understanding. The careful distance they'd been maintaining had evaporated, replaced by acknowledgement of the connection that had been building between them since the beginning. "So what happens now?" Alvara asked. "Now," Jarth said, his thumb tracing her cheek gently. "We take things one day at a time. I court you properly, you teach me how to be useful on a ranch, and we see where this leads us." "Court me?" Alvara laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in weeks. "This isn't Boston society, Jarth. We don't have formal courtship rituals out here." "Then I'll have to improvise," he said with a grin that made her pulse quicken. "Lucky for me, I'm adaptable." Over the following weeks, Jarth proved himself to be remarkably adaptable indeed. He began riding out to the ranch every few days, ostensibly to check on Alvara's recovery, but increasingly just to spend time with her. At first, his Eastern mannerisms and obvious inexperience with ranch work provided endless amusement for both Alvara and Miguel, but gradually he began to find his place in the rhythm of ranch life. He couldn't rope cattle or brand steers, but he could treat injuries and illnesses with a skill that proved invaluable during the busy autumn season. When one of the ranch hands was kicked by a horse, Jarth set the broken arm with professional competence. When several head of cattle developed respiratory infections, his veterinary knowledge helped save the herd. More importantly, he listened. He asked questions about ranch operations, not with the condescension of someone humoring her, but with genuine interest in understanding her world. He learned the names of her horses, memorized the layout of her property, and even began to develop opinions about cattle breeding that weren't entirely uninformed. "He's good for you," Miguel observed one evening as they watched Jarth attempting to mend a section of fence under Miguel's patient instruction. "He's terrible at fence repair. Alvara replied, though her tone was fond rather than critical. I'm not talking about the fence. Alvara knew exactly what Miguel meant. In the weeks since she'd allowed Jarth into her life, something fundamental had shifted in her. The hard edges that years of solitude and struggle had carved into her personality were beginning to soften. She laughed more often, worried less about maintaining perfect control, and found herself looking forward to the future with an optimism she hadn't felt since her father's death. He is good for me, she admitted. I just hope I'm good for him. You are, Miguel said, with certainty. That man was half dead when he came to Texas, running from whatever demons were chasing him back east. Look at him now. Alvara did look, taking in the way Jarth's face had filled out since he'd started taking regular meals at the ranch. The way his pale skin had bronzed under the Texas sun, the confidence that had replaced the careful reserve he'd worn like armor during their first meetings. But it was more than physical changes that marked his transformation. The Jarth who had first examined her had been professionally competent but emotionally distant, a man going through the motions of a life that didn't quite fit him. This Jarth, the one currently cursing creatively as he struggled with a particularly stubborn fence post, was alive in a way that had nothing to do with his medical training and everything to do with having found a place where he belonged. Maybe we're good for each other, she said finally. Maybe you are, Miguel agreed. Question is, what are you going to do about it? That question became more pressing as autumn deepened into winter. Jarth's visits to the ranch had become so regular that he'd essentially taken up residence in the guest room, though they maintained the fiction that his presence was temporary. The boundaries of their relationship remained carefully negotiated, intimate conversation and gentle affection, but always with the awareness that they were still learning how to trust each other completely. It was during one of the season's first snowstorms that everything changed. Alvara woke to the sound of cattle bawling in distress and immediately knew something was wrong. Through her bedroom window, she could see several head of cattle grouped against the barn, seeking shelter from the driving snow and wind. She dressed quickly and made her way outside, where the full force of the storm hit her like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped dramatically overnight, and what had started as a light snowfall had become a genuine blizzard. Miguel met her at the barn, his face grim with concern. We've got problems, mija. The cattle in the north pasture are cut off by the storm. If we don't get them to shelter soon. He didn't need to finish. Cattle could freeze to death in conditions like these, and losing even a few head would be financially devastating for the still recovering ranch. How many men can we spare? Alvara asked, already calculating distances and risks. 3, maybe 4, but in this weather. We'll have to try, Alvara said firmly. We can't afford to lose those cattle. It was then that Jarth appeared, bundled in a heavy coat and looking determined despite his obvious inexperience with blizzard conditions. I'm coming with you, he announced. Absolutely not, Alvara said immediately. You don't know the territory and you're not experienced enough with cattle to be useful in these conditions. I know enough to hold a rope and follow orders, Jarth replied stubbornly. And you need every able-bodied person you can get. Jarth, this is dangerous. So is doing nothing, he interrupted. Those cattle represent your livelihood and my investment. I have as much stake in their survival as you do. Miguel looked between them, clearly torn between practical need and concern for Jarth's safety. Finally, practical need won. We could use another rider, he admitted reluctantly. But you stay close to me, Doctor. No heroics. The next several hours were a nightmare of driving snow, brutal cold, and exhausting work. Finding the scattered cattle in the blizzard was nearly impossible, and herding them toward shelter required every ounce of skill and determination the small group possessed. Jarth proved to be more capable than anyone had expected. While he couldn't match the experienced cowboy's expertise with rope and horse, he followed directions without question and never complained about the brutal conditions. When his horse went down in a hidden gully, he climbed back on and kept working despite what was clearly a painful fall. By the time they had driven the last of the cattle to safety, all of them were exhausted, frozen, and running on pure determination. But they had saved the herd, and more importantly, they had done it together. Back at the ranch house, as they all warmed themselves around the kitchen fire, Alvara found herself looking at Jarth with new respect. The man who had ridden out into the blizzard wasn't the soft Eastern doctor she'd first met. He was someone who had proven himself willing to risk his own safety for her ranch, her cattle, her livelihood. "Thank you," she said quietly when they were finally alone. "For what? For today, for helping save the cattle, for proving that I can depend on you when things get difficult." Jarth's smile was tired but satisfied. "Does this mean I've passed some kind of test?" "Maybe," Alvara admitted, "or maybe we both have." That night, as the storm continued to rage, outside Alvara lay in her bed and thought about everything that had changed since Jarth had entered her life. The loan that had once felt like a burden now seemed like the beginning of a partnership. The man she'd once seen as a threat to her independence had become someone she could imagine sharing her future with. The realization both thrilled and terrified her, but for the first time the thrill was stronger than the fear. Tomorrow, when the storm cleared, she would have to make a decision about what she wanted their relationship to become. Tonight she was content to listen to the wind and snow and imagine what it might feel like to build a life with someone who had proven himself worthy of her trust. In the guest room down the hall, Jarth Cobburn was having similar thoughts, though his focused more on the woman who had allowed him into her world, despite every instinct telling her to remain independent. As he drifted off to sleep, he found himself hoping that tomorrow might bring the courage to tell her exactly how much she meant to him. And perhaps, if he was very lucky, she might find the courage to tell him the same thing. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world transformed under a blanket of pristine snow that sparkled like diamonds in the early morning light. Alvara woke to an unusual quiet, the kind of profound silence that only came after nature had exhausted itself in fury and settled into peaceful exhaustion. She found Jarth already awake in the kitchen, standing at the window with a cup of coffee in his hands, watching the sun rise over the snow-covered landscape. His hair was still disheveled from sleep, and he wore the same clothes from yesterday's rescue mission, but there was something different about him this morning, a sense of belonging that hadn't been there before. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, without turning around, somehow sensing her presence. "It is," Alvara agreed, though she found herself looking at him rather than the scenery. "How long have you been up?" "Couple of hours. I wanted to check on the cattle, make sure they all made it through the night." The casual way he said, "I wanted to check," sent warmth flooding through her chest. Not "someone should check" or "you should check," but "I wanted to check." As if her cattle had become his concern, her problems his responsibility. "And they're all accounted for," Jarth said, finally turning to face her. "Cold and cranky but alive. Miguel says we didn't lose a single head." Alvara felt a surge of relief so profound it nearly buckled her knees. Those cattle represented months of careful planning, her hope for the ranch's financial recovery, and quite possibly Jarth's confidence in her ability to repay his loan. "Thank you," she said softly, "for yesterday, for this morning, for everything." Jarth set down his coffee cup and crossed the kitchen to stand before her, his brown eyes serious and intent. "Alvara, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her pulse quicken with sudden anxiety. "What is it? Yesterday, when we were out there in the storm, when I saw how much those cattle meant to you and realized I might lose you to the cold or an accident." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I realized that I can't keep pretending this is just friendship or even just courtship. I'm in love with you, Alvara. Completely, irrevocably, terrifyingly in love with you." The words hit her like lightning, illuminating feelings she'd been trying to keep in shadow. She'd known her feelings for him were deepening, had felt the pull of attraction and affection growing stronger with each passing day. But hearing him name it as love, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, as he waited for her response, made everything suddenly brilliantly clear. "Jarth," she whispered, her voice catching with emotion. "I know it's complicated," he continued quickly, as if afraid she might interrupt with objections. "I know we haven't known each other very long, and I know the lone creates complications. But yesterday made me realize that life is too uncertain to waste time on fear. I love you, and I want to build a life with you, and I needed you to know that." Alvara stared at him, overwhelmed by the courage it had taken for him to lay his heart bare like that. Here was this educated, sophisticated man from a world of privilege and refinement, offering to tie his fate to a stubborn rancher's daughter who'd nearly gotten him killed in a blizzard. "You could have anyone," she said finally. "Any proper Boston lady who'd give you a respectable life, children, who speak with the right accent, a social position that matters." "I don't want any proper Boston lady," Jarth said firmly. "I want the woman who trusted me with her life, who saved an entire herd of cattle in a blizzard, who built something extraordinary out of nothing but determination and courage. I want you, Alvara, all of you, your strength, your stubbornness, your fierce independence, and yes, even your cattle." The last phrase made her laugh despite the tears that were threatening to spill down her cheeks. "Even my cattle, especially your cattle," Jarth said solemnly, "though I reserve the right to complain when they're being particularly difficult." This time Alvara did laugh, a sound full of joy and relief, and something that might have been the last of her resistance crumbling. "I love you too," she said simply. Jarth's face transformed with relief and happiness so profound that it took her breath away. "You do, I do," she confirmed. "I've been fighting it for weeks, telling myself it was too soon, too complicated, too risky. But yesterday, watching you risk your neck for my cattle, seeing how naturally you fit into my world, I realized that loving you isn't the risk. Not loving you is." Jarth closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, gathering her into his arms and kissing her with all the passion and tenderness that had been building between them for months. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more urgent, full of promise and commitment, and the kind of desperate relief that came with finally admitting the truth. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Alvara found herself laughing with pure happiness. "What's so funny?" Jarth asked, though he was grinning too. "I was just thinking that if someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be standing in my kitchen at dawn, kissing a doctor from Boston and planning a future that included someone other than myself, I'd have checked them for fever. And now I can't imagine my future without you in it." Jarth's expression grew serious again, though the joy never left his eyes. "Alvara, I want to marry you." The words hung in the air between them, representing everything she'd never thought she wanted, and everything she now realized she couldn't live without. "Is that a proposal?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a statement of intent," Jarth said carefully. "The actual proposal will come when I've done this properly, asked your permission, if not your father's blessing, then at least Miguel's gotten a ring, planned something special." "Jarth," Alvara interrupted, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "Yes, I don't need special. I don't need a ring or formal proposals or anyone's blessing but our own. I need you, and I need the promise that we're going to build something together that's stronger than either of us could manage alone." "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes," she confirmed, and then she was kissing him again, sealing a promise that would change both their lives forever. The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted them, and they broke apart just as Miguel entered the kitchen, stomping snow off his feet and muttering about the cold. He looked up to find them standing suspiciously close together, both flushed and grinning, and his weathered face immediately creased into a knowing smile. "Well," he said mildly, hanging up his coat, I guess the storm brought more than just snow. Miguel, Alvara said, sudden nervousness replacing her euphoria. Jarth and we're going to be married. Miguel's smile broadened into a grin that threatened to split his face in half. About damn time, he said, crossing the kitchen to clasp Jarth's hand in a firm shake. Welcome to the family doctor. Hope you know what you're getting yourself into. I'm beginning to, Jarth replied, glancing at Alvara with an expression of such love and contentment that it made her heart skip. When's the wedding? Miguel asked. Alvara and Jarth looked at each other, realizing they hadn't discussed any of the practical details. Soon, Alvara said finally. As soon as we can arrange it. I don't want to wait. Neither do I, Jarth agreed. But there are some things we need to figure out first. Where we'll live, how to combine my practice with ranch life, what this means for the loan. The loan gets transferred to both our names, Alvara said immediately. This ranch becomes our responsibility together, not just mine. Are you sure you've worked so hard to maintain your independence? I'm not giving up my independence, Alvara corrected. I'm choosing to share it with someone I trust completely. There's a difference. Miguel nodded approvingly. Your papa would be proud, mija. He always said the strongest people were the ones smart enough to know when they'd found a good partner. Over the following weeks, their engagement became the talk of Bitter Creek. Some folks expressed surprise that the independent Alvara Trenholm would marry at all, while others seemed to think it was about time she settled down. But the general consensus was that Dr. Cowgirl was a good match for her, educated enough to appreciate her intelligence, strong enough to handle her stubbornness, and devoted enough to stick around when things got difficult. The wedding itself was planned for Christmas Eve, partly because it seemed romantically appropriate, but mostly because both Alvara and Jarth were impatient to make their union official. The ceremony would be held in Bitter Creek's small church, followed by a celebration at the ranch for anyone who cared to come. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Jarth proved himself to be remarkably adaptable to the demands of ranch life. He moved his medical practice to a small office attached to the ranch house, allowing him to serve the local community while still participating in the daily operations of the ranch. His Eastern education proved unexpectedly useful in modernizing some of their breeding and feeding techniques, while Alvara's practical experience kept his more theoretical ideas grounded in reality. They made an unlikely partnership, but an effective one. Where Alvara was impulsive, Jarth was thoughtful. Where he was cautious, she was bold. Together they began to transform the ranch from a struggling operation into something approaching prosperity. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Jarth's first attempt at branding cattle resulted in more burned fingers than properly marked steers, and Alvara's impatience with his methodical approach to everything led to several spirited arguments. But they learned to appreciate their differences, to see them as strengths rather than obstacles. You balance each other, Miguel observed one evening as he watched them work together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by the storm. She makes him braver, he makes her more thoughtful. Good combination. As Christmas Eve approached, Bitter Creek buzzed with preparation for what many considered the social event of the season. The church was decorated with pine boughs and candles, and half the town seemed determined to attend the ceremony that would unite their beloved doctor with their most notorious independent woman. The night before the wedding, Alvara sat on her front porch, wrapped in a heavy quilt, watching the stars and thinking about how drastically her life was about to change. Tomorrow she would no longer be Alvara Trenholm, lone wolf of the Texas frontier. She would be Mrs. Jarth Cobburn, part of a partnership that would define the rest of her life. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a deep sense of rightness, as if all the struggles and loneliness of her past had been leading to this moment. Having second thoughts. Jarth's voice came from the doorway, and she turned to see him leaning against the frame, watching her with gentle concern. Third and fourth thoughts, she admitted, but not the kind you're worried about." He came to sit beside her, and she automatically shifted to share the quilt with him. "What kind, then?" "Thoughts about how different everything's going to be," Alvara said softly. "Tomorrow I wake up married, part of a team, instead of just myself. It's what I want, but it's still significant." "Significant," Jarth agreed. "And permanent. Are you ready for permanent?" Alvara turned to look at him in the starlight, taking in the face that had become so dear to her, the eyes that looked at her with love and acceptance and unwavering commitment. "With you, I'm ready for anything." The wedding dawned clear and cold, with a crispness in the air that made everything seem sharper, more vivid. Alvara woke alone for what she realized would be the last time in her life, and the thought filled her with anticipation rather than anxiety. She dressed carefully in the one formal gown she owned, a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother, altered by the town seamstress to fit her tall frame. It wasn't the elaborate creation a Boston bride might wear, but it was beautiful in its simplicity and carried the weight of family history. Miguel appeared at her door precisely at noon, dressed in his best suit and looking uncharacteristically emotional. "Ready, mija. Ready," Alvara confirmed, though her hands shook slightly as she took his arm. The church was packed with virtually everyone from Bitter Creek and the surrounding ranches. As Alvara walked down the aisle on Miguel's arm, she was struck by the number of faces smiling at her with genuine warmth and approval. These people had watched her struggle and fight and nearly lose everything, and now they were here to celebrate her happiness. But all of that faded when she saw Jarth waiting for her at the altar. He wore a dark suit that emphasized his lean frame and serious brown eyes, and when he smiled at her, everything else in the world seemed to disappear. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of traditional words and heartfelt vows. Alvara heard herself promising to love, honor, and cherish this man for the rest of her life, and the words felt like the most natural thing she'd ever said. When Jarth made the same promises to her, his voice steady and sure, she felt something deep inside her settle into place, as if a puzzle piece she hadn't known was missing had finally been found. "You may kiss the bride," the minister announced, and Jarth's kiss was gentle and reverent, full of promise for all the days to come. As they turned to face their community as husband and wife, Alvara felt a surge of joy so profound it nearly overwhelmed her. This was what she'd been afraid of, this connection, this vulnerability, this complete intertwining of her fate with another person's, and it was the most wonderful thing she'd ever experienced. The celebration at the ranch lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing under the stars. Alvara had never been much for social gatherings, but tonight she found herself genuinely enjoying the chance to celebrate with the people who had become her community. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, she and Jarth finally found themselves alone on the front porch of what was now their shared home. "So," Jarth said, pulling her close against the December chill, "how does it feel to be married?" "Different," Alvara said honestly. "Good different, but definitely different. How about you?" "Like I've finally found where I belong," he replied simply. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out over the ranch that was now truly theirs together. "Jarth, thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up on me," Alvara said softly, "for seeing past my stubbornness to whatever was underneath, for making me brave enough to want this." "Thank you for letting me in," Jarth replied, "for trusting me with your heart when every instinct told you not to, for teaching me what it means to find home in a person rather than a place." As if summoned by their words, the future seemed to stretch out before them, full of promise and possibility. There would be challenges ahead. The ranch would have good years and difficult ones. They would disagree and argue and make up. There would be loss and joy and all the ordinary miracles that made up a life shared between two people. But tonight, on their wedding night under the vast Texas sky, all of that was still to come. Tonight there was only the warmth of Jarth's arms around her, the steady beat of his heart against her ear, and the absolute certainty that she had found her match in this gentle, stubborn, wonderful man who had refused to let her face the world alone. "I love you, Mrs. Cobburn," Jarth murmured against her hair. "I love you too, Mr. Cobburn," she replied, and marveled at how natural the name sounded, how right it felt to claim it as her own. Years later, when people asked them about their courtship, Alvara and Jarth would tell different parts of the story. She would talk about learning to trust, about the terrifying joy of letting someone else be strong when she needed it. He would speak of finding purpose in love, of discovering that the life he'd been running toward had been waiting for him in the last place he'd expected to find it. But they would always agree on the most important part, that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't in facing danger alone, but in choosing to face it together, and that the words, "Just lay back and let me take care of you," weren't about weakness or surrender, but about the profound strength that came from knowing you had found someone worthy of your complete trust. Under the endless Texas sky, with the ranch spreading out around them in the moonlight, Alvara and Jarth Cobburn began their life together with hearts full of love and hope and the unshakable conviction that they had found in each other everything they had ever needed. The stubborn cowgirl and the displaced doctor had become something neither could have been alone, a partnership forged in crisis and strengthened by choice, a love story that would endure through all the joys and sorrows that lay ahead. And in the years that followed, as their children played in the same red dirt, where Alvara had once broken wild horses alone, as the ranch prospered under their combined stewardship, as their hair turned gray and their love deepened into something unbreakable, they would look back on this night as the moment when their real lives began, the moment when two people who had been afraid to need anyone discovered that needing each other was the greatest strength of all.